Welcome to History of the Netherlands, where we explore the events and characters that, over time, have transformed a swamp into an amazing modern marvel. Episode 59, Successive Crises, Amidst a Looming Succession Crisis. During the first decade of the 16th century, one of the primary concerns for the towns, cities, and ducal governments of the Low Countries was the war the Habsburgs were waging with Charles of Egmont over the title of Duke of Guelders. The war in Guelders complicated the already convoluted political structure that had developed across the Low Countries over the course of the previous half-century. In this episode, we are going to focus on Guelders once more, but this time to see how the war was intimately entangled in a web of relationships between the different layers of nobility, both domestic and foreign, and how the interests of the Habsburg dynasty often clashed with the interests of the people who lived within their domains. When Philip the Handsome sailed away to Spain, as covered in the previous episode, Charles of Egmont seized the opportunity to restart the war, meaning the defense of the Habsburg lands was left to the man Philip had put in charge in his absence, his stadtholder or lieutenant general Guillaume de Croix, the Lord of Chièvres. Philip's premature death would completely rearrange the pieces on the chessboard as the Low Countries were once again plunged into a seeming succession crisis. There was one giant mess left behind to be cleaned up, and the person who would ultimately become the regent for Philip's infant son, Charles, would be the one who would have to do it. That person would be Philip's sister, Margaret of Austria. As just mentioned, the political structures of the Low Countries at the start of the 16th century were complex. We already well know about the autonomous nature of the Dutch towns and cities, whose concerns ranged from maintaining their commercial viability, particularly as related to the important trade connections with England, to the factionalism that had erupted in the conflicts between the Hooks and the Cods in Holland, or the Scheringers and Vetkopers in Frisia, to the imposition of an imperial agenda on the Netherlandish estates by the as good as Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg in his capacity firstly as the husband of Mary of Burgundy and then as the regent for their son Philip. There was also the constant need for vigilance against the machinations of the French king, whether in the form of Louis XI, Charles VIII, or since the latter's death by doorframe in 1498, Louis XII. Maximilian's enmity with the French king had fueled a seemingly influx web of alliances that spanned Western Europe and which played out on battlefields on both sides of the Alps. In this episode, we are going to keep focusing on Guelders, but in ways which highlight how the issue of Guelders fit into the complexities of all this and which demonstrate how different the lens of political development was 500 years ago to, firstly, how it is today, but also to how we tend to look back at the past. Whenever we are casting our eyes back at history, it is almost impossible to do so without the filters that have been constructed in the years, decades, and centuries since the events we are looking at. For example, take the name of this podcast, History of the Netherlands. Any astute and committed listener, we love you, will have at times been well aware that we spend almost as much time talking about areas that are not the Netherlands as we do otherwise. That is because if we are to successfully build up the narrative of events and characters that contributed towards the existence of the state of the Netherlands as we know it today, we need to recognize that those people had no idea, intent, or sense of what that modern state might be. At the higher levels of aristocratic politicking, what mattered to people like Maximilian or the French king was themselves, their bloodlines, and usually the establishment or continuation of their own dynasties. Policies were often made by personalities. The French king was the French state. Maximilian's agenda was the House of Habsburg, not the internal stability of life for people living in territories that he saw as belonging to him by virtue of God. To him, he had as much right in making decisions about Turkish encroachments upon the areas of Hungary and Eastern Austria as he did in which prince his daughter should marry, or what arrangements should be made with the English king regarding trade with Dutch towns. Maximilian's example is a macro one, but there were nobles of all different, I want to say sizes, but might just say levels of influence, for whom this was the lens through which they saw the world. They each had their own agendas that were not necessarily aligned with what was best for the societies and communities that would make up the polities that would much later be labeled with all-encompassing national identities like the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, etc. One man in the Netherlands whose position during the outbreak of the Guelders War epitomized these complications which embroiled the Low Countries was the Imperial Count Oswald van den Berg. His territory lay between Guelders and Cleves, and he was a bannerman and vassal to the Duke of Guelders. As a young man, he had undertaken a pilgrimage with Adolf of Egmont, the father of the man who, by the 1490s, was defiantly claiming this title, Charles of Egmont, against whom Maximilian and Philip the Handsome were in conflict over the Duchy of Guelders. Despite this intimate connection to the Egmonts, being an imperial count meant Oswald was also a vassal of Maximilian, so he cleverly sought not to get too involved in the conflict between Charles of Egmont and Maximilian of Habsburg. He remained fairly neutral throughout the increase of tensions and eruption of conflict between the two of his liege lords, even though the violence that raked the lands around him also spilled into his domains from time to time. In one of Maximilian's failed attempts to subjugate the upper quarter of Guelders in the late 1490s, it had looked like he was going to attack the lands of Oswald himself, but was held off by the defiant citizens of Zutphen at Elten. Shortly after, in his capacity as King of the Romans, Maximilian then summoned Oswald to come to the German town of Worms with an armed force so that they could go and fight the Turks together. Talk about an emotional roller coaster. The fact that Maximilian had so many fingers in so many pies, but that his reach into the Low Countries flowed through his paternal connection to its ruling family certainly contributed to the generally complex nature of the situation there. If Oswald did obey his imperial overlord, he would also be greatly irritating Charles of Egmont, his rebellious but powerful lord and the son of his dear late friend. Oswald felt that the autonomy of his house and lands were paramount, of course, and when Maximilian pushed for Oswald to swear an oath to him as the Duke of Guelders, Oswald was very reticent to do so. In the end, however, he, like many of the ducal bannermen of Guelders, succumbed, largely because Maximilian was already their imperial suzerain. So, were he to be recognized as the Duke of Guelders as well, it would make Oswald's life that much easier. As a consequence for doing this, Charles of Egmont promptly declared Oswald's possessions forfeit and captured his castle of Nyburg. In early 1499, Maximilian did his usual thing and got distracted by a war in Italy and pretty much abandoned the fight in Guelders, leaving Van den Berg surrounded by enemies, seen as a traitor by Charles and bereft of help or consideration from his imperial lord whom he had staked his future on. When Oswald learned in September 1500 that Charles was about to plunder his lands, he sought help from the towns of Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Zutphen, who managed to broker an agreement. This involved Oswald paying Charles a heap of money, and Oswald's son pledging allegiance to Charles, who would enfeoff him once Oswald had kicked the bucket. The autonomy of Van den Berg, it seems, despite Oswald's best efforts, was going to be snuffed out whether he liked it or not. In 1502, Charles of Egmont broke the truce between himself and the Habsburgs and went on the expedition that saw him being rescued by Jacob the Moor following a failed attack on the town of Huissen. Maximilian went on the offensive in Guelders again in 1503, though Oswald managed to come to a truce with the Habsburgs in 1504. This was presumably undertaken in negotiation with Habsburg Phil, the Handsome, who was by then also calling himself the Stadhouder General, or the Lieutenant General of Guelders and Zutphen. A letter purportedly from Oswald to Philip, using the above-mentioned title, exists in the archives of Habsburg, which outlines Oswald's desires in negotiating this peace, such as getting back the lands and titles that Charles of Egmont had dispossessed him of, as well as gaining a couple more. As Michiel Faber wrote in his dissertation on the topic titled Tussen Gelre and Habsburg, Between Guelders and Habsburg, quote, whether this letter was ultimately sent is unclear. However, it does indicate that Oswald believed there was room for negotiation, end quote. Oswald did not get everything that he had sought, but he and his son did end up swearing loyalty to the Habsburgs once again in 1505, which kind of restored the autonomy that he had sought to preserve. Also in 1505, Maximilian invested Philip the Handsome with the title Duke of Guelders, after which Philip led the campaign himself that saw the Habsburgs occupy 2 of the 4 quarters of Guelders and capture Charles of Egmont. This led to the tenuous peace of the Treaty of Tiel, which we spoke about in the previous episode, where Charles was supposed to go to Spain with Habsburg Phil, but instead did what I think I would do if I ever found myself in an armed conflict and ran away towards home. There is a slight tangent which we want to go down here, as it ties together some reference points which have long been made in this podcast, including in the previous episode when we spoke about Habsburg Phil getting stuck in England following a storm while on his way to Spain, and then being coerced into the Intercursus Malleus, the evil trade agreement by the English King Henry VII. It is a story that demonstrates how what might be called the history of England can also be the history of the Netherlands, the history of France, or even the history of Spain, because those involved in the decision-making processes at the highest levels did not see themselves as defined by the national boundaries that have been discerned since, and which we recognize today. And we're not even going to mention the all-encompassing identity marker that existed of Christianity that swept over all of them. You might remember that part of the Intercursus Malleus was the forced return of an English nobleman called Edmund de la Pole, the 3rd Earl of Suffolk, who was the last remaining Yorkist claimant to the English throne, pertinent to the Wars of the Roses that we spoke about way back. Well, the story of Edmund de la Pole is enticingly intermingled with those of many of our protagonists and highlights several key points about the events and characters whom we have spent so much time talking about. It also shows how the Guelders Wars meant something different to the upper nobility of Europe than what it did for the everyday Kees and Geertruid, whose towns and villages were laid waste in the process. The fate of Edmund de la Pole was of the utmost importance amongst many in the elite of Western European society, whilst being of zero importance to pretty much everybody else. So, down the rabbit hole we go. Edmond de la Pole's grandfather had descended from the English King Edward III, and he had been the Duke of York. So at the turn of the 16th century, after the Wars of the Roses between York and Lancaster had pretty much been concluded, Edmund actually had a stronger claim to the throne than the man who now sat on it, the incumbent King Henry VII, who came from a dubious Lancastrian lineage and was sometimes, or even often, referred to as the usurper. The biggest champion of the Yorkist cause outside of England was, as we well know, that magnificent woman, Margaret of York, who had helped to raise Philip the Handsome and Margaret of Austria in her role as their step-grandmother. Margaret had long been a bane of the young Tudor dynasty, which, by the way, was not at this time called the Tudors by anybody except perhaps some detractors, and was not yet a dynasty. She had funded more than one expedition to put a Yorkist on the English throne, including the impostors Lambert Simnel in 1487 and Perkin Warbeck 10 years later, both claiming to be one of the fabled princes in the Tower. When Edmund de la Pole was arrested in 1498 for killing a commoner, he was offered a pardon if he swore an oath of fealty to Henry VII, also sometimes known today as Henry Tudor. Instead of doing this, Edmund fled to the continent and sought refuge with the Archduke of Burgundy, Philip the Handsome, and his imperial father Maximilian. as both were seeking good relations with England. Remember that Maximilian's focus at this point was on maintaining the anti-French coalition between him, the Spanish monarch, and England. He advised de la Pole to just suck it up and submissively return to England to earn Henry VII's favour. Though he tried to do this, it did not last long, as in June 1500, Henry met with Philip the Handsome in Calais and sought to humiliate de la Pole once again by forcing him to swear an oath in front of them both. Over the next year, de la Pole stewed in his own anger. Unbeknownst to him, however, Maximilian was also doing Maximilian things. One of the emperor's main goals was to raise an army against the Turks who were threatening his familial lands in Austria. It is thought that Henry VII got in his bad books by refusing to lend any support for this endeavour. It also seems that a Yorkist sympathiser from England called Robert Curzon, who had come into Maximilian's favour, had gotten in his ear about returning the so-called White Rose, which is the appellation used for a Yorkist claimant, to the English throne. According to W. E. Hampton in his work, The White Rose Under the First Tudors, quote, "The executions of Warwick and Warbeck had not passed unnoticed in Europe, and when Curzon related to Maximilian Henry's murders and tyrannies, the indignant emperor declared that if he might have one of Edward's blood in his hands, he would help that man to," and this is a quote within the quote, "recover the crown of England and be revenged upon Henry, should it cost him 1 year's revenue from all his lands," end quote. That is the kind of dramatic grandstanding that one might reasonably expect to come from Maximilian of Habsburg. Curzon apparently related this sentiment to de la Pole, and when he escaped England for the second time in 1501, alongside his brother Richard, they went to the Austrian Alps, where they were granted an audience with Maximilian at a place called Amidst in the Tyrol. Egmont declared, quote, "plainly to his grace the murders done by Henry, and that Henry also intended to have murdered him and his brother," end quote. Apparently this meeting went pretty well, with Maximilian calling him beloved cousin, but the next day de la Pole was informed that Maximilian could not help him without risking the good relations between his son Philip and the English king. Nonetheless, de la Pole was convinced to hang around, and after 6 weeks of doing so, he was bewilderingly promised 3,000 to 5,000 troops and the use of them for up to 3 months to go and get his crown. Yes, according to this story, Maximilian had decided to help a Yorkist invasion of England. Edmond de la Pole must have been stoked. Henry VII, who found out about the meeting not long after, was not. His subsequent bloodletting against supporters and kin of de la Pole in England was intense. After getting the assurance from Max, Edmund went off to Aachen, the free imperial city, to garner more support, and where it was said that he would be safe from Tudor assassins. There, he sat and waited for the imperial army that Maximilian had promised him would materialize, and for preparations to be complete for a channel crossing. He waited, and he waited. Well, had de la Pole had the chance to listen to this podcast, he would have known that a Maximilian promise was about as sturdy as a fart in the wind. The truth is that Maximilian might have been emperor, but the real hard power lay with the independent German princes of the empire who provided the actual troops. Just as they had been reticent to support his efforts to subdue parts of Italy, they were not too keen on providing men and money for more Habsburg expansionist projects in the direction of England. The troops did not materialize. De la Pole stayed in Aachen for 2 years until 1504, becoming more and more indebted to creditors whose harassment of him for money became more and more steadfast. Little did he know that already in July 1502 at Augsburg, Maximilian had accepted a £10,000 bribe from English diplomats sent by Henry to persuade him to not assist the Yorkist rebels anymore. Further to this, the balance of power was shifting, as we have seen in previous episodes. Spain, read Ferdinand, and France were at war with each other in Italy, and Philip and Joanna, Ferdinand's daughter, had gone offside with the Spanish monarchs by grabbing onto their titles as the crown princes of Castile, while Maximilian and Louis XII were somehow becoming more aligned with each other. Basically, nobody wanted to gain the English king Henry Tudor as an enemy. A whole lot of diplomatic higgledy-piggledy ensued. Not only was the English king trying to get his hands on Edmund de la Pole, the 3rd Earl of Suffolk, but now so too were Isabella and Ferdinand, who had sent an agent up to bring him back to Naples. This gives an indicator of what a random and volatile piece Edmund de la Pole had become on the great European chessboard. Enough pressure mounted that de la Pole eventually had to leave Aachen, though he had to leave his brother as a hostage to their creditors. In April 1504, de la Pole set out for Friesland and the protection of the Duke of Saxony, George, whose father Albert we know well from having made himself into the potestas or governor of Friesland. Albert had died in 1500, and his son George was now dealing with the ever-risable Frisians, trying to maintain some sort of control over them. Apparently, the initial correspondence with George went well, though as a diehard Habsburg loyalist, he was never likely to actually lend his support against the wishes of Maximilian. But just as likely, he probably would not give de la Pole up to the Spanish, the French, or the English. If you have a look at a map and trace a direct route from Aachen to Friesland, you will see that if you want to go from one to the other, there is a whole chunk of Guelders in the way. So, in an effort to secure safe passage, Edmund wrote to Charles of Egmont asking for such. This being granted, Charles invited him to dinner at the castle of Hutton, and it is there that Edmund de la Pole would remain for over a year, essentially a prisoner of Charles of Egmont who, being backed by the French king against Philip the Handsome, refused to give him up. It was, however, around this time that Philip managed to get enough money from his estates to both wage the successful campaign against Charles of Egmont that we mentioned earlier, and to thereafter set sail for Spain to claim his kingship. In the course of a short but successful campaign in Guelders in the summer of 1505, both Charles of Egmont and Edmund de la Pole ended up in Philip's hands. As we covered in the previous episode, Philip the Handsome then went off to Spain to become king, but got stuck in England on the way, and as part of the intercursus malus, or evil trade deal, that was foisted upon him before he could leave England, he gave de la Pole up to Henry VII before continuing on to Spain. De la Pole would be locked up in the Tower of London and eventually executed 7 years later. Meanwhile, Philip ended up a corpse in Burgos, being faithfully attended to by his grieving and reputationally unstable wife, Joanna. Like the story of Oswald van den Berg, the story of Edmund de la Pole once more highlights how the decisions of international policy being made were so often more about the personal relationships between members of the ruling nobility than about the interests of those whom they ruled or sought to rule. Talking about vested interests, here's an ad break, after the likes of which we shall greet you on the other side. Welcome to the iedereen. Welcome back, everybody. So, let's get back to the war in Guelders. Under the terms of the Treaty of Tiel, which was the truce agreement between Philip the Handsome and Charles of Egmont after Charles's capture in July 1505, Charles had been required to accompany Philip on his journey to Spain to be crowned as King of Castile. As we saw in the previous episode, however, Charles of Egmont made up a frivolous excuse about being too ill for the journey and escaped from Antwerp before the ship set sail. This had very much displeased Philip, but since he was too busy with his whole Castilian crown plans, he could not deal with the Guelders situation himself. Instead, Philip entrusted the defense of his lands to Guillaume de Croix, the Lord of Chièvres, whom he appointed as his stadhouder or lieutenant general, his representative in his absence. It's a title that we will become intimately familiar with. As big a Francophile as Croix was, even he saw that his government had to take action against the French-backed Guelderian insurgents. You might remember that although Philip had captured Charles of Egmont in the hostilities in 1505, he had only occupied half of the lands of Guelders being the Veluwe quarter and the Zutphen quarter. So upon his return to Guelders, Charles of Egmont got busy trying to reclaim that which had been taken from him by Philip. In early 1506, Charles of Egmont was able to capture the cities of Groenlo, Lokum, and Wageningen. In his 18th century history of the Netherlands, Jan Wagenaar quotes a letter written in Spain by Philip the Handsome to Charles of Egmont after this event, saying that, quote, he would sorely lament this breaking of the treaty and that no ally, no matter how powerful, would be able to protect him, end quote. By this, of course, he was referring to Charles of Egmont's most powerful ally, the French king Louis XII. The conflict in Guelders continued through the summer of 1506. However, the ability of both sides to wage war effectively were hampered by various issues. For Charles of Egmont and his supporters in Guelders, the main issue was, as always, that they were stuck hoping that the French king would actually send some blokes with weapons to come and help them out. For the Habsburgs, represented by Guillaume de Croix, their biggest issue was, as always, a lack of money. Philip the Handsome had already milked his subjects dry while raising funds for his journey to Spain, and the ongoing war in Guelders was continuously expensive. It was also unpopular, being seen more as a Habsburg dynastic feud rather than one being fought in the interests of the lands themselves. As such, the states of his lands refused to give more money for this war, just as they had decades previously when Philip's grandfather Charles the Bold was waging wars in faraway places and demanding cash to pay for it all. When the Habsburg soldiers seemed on the verge of mutiny because they weren't getting paid, officials and servants at the court had to forego their own wages so that the soldiers could receive some money. They barely had the resources to field a meager army of 3,000 soldiers and 200 knights across Guelders, which would not be enough should French troops actually arrive to help Charles of Egmont. In addition to this, the Intercursus Malus trade deal, which Philip had been forced to sign with Henry VII, had meant people across his lands were feeling the pinch. There was some hope that perhaps in light of the deal there, including the proposed marriage between Henry VII and, guess who, Margaret of Austria, that Henry would send help to the Low Countries from England, especially considering he must have still resented Charles of Egmont for having held onto Edmund de la Pole for such a long time. Henry VII, however, wasn't actually interested in doing much to help with the war in Guelders, other than sending sternly worded letters to Louis XII telling him to stop supporting Charles of Egmont. All in all, the English alliance seemed to offer no benefits and many downsides. The main thrust in this war by the Habsburgs was a siege on the town of Wageningen, which began in June 1506. Guillaume de Croix, the Lord of Chièvres, placed the siege under the direction of the Admiral of the Netherlands, Philip of Burgundy, one of Philip the Good's many bastard children, though now he was a man in his 40s, a relative elder, who was still running around. The siege would last for 4 months before it eventually had to be lifted due to the lack of funds, much to the fury of Philip of Burgundy. There was also an attempt by the Habsburgs to capture the town of Nijmegen by subterfuge, enlisting the help of 2 mayors of the city. Unfortunately for them, the plot was discovered. One of the said mayors died after falling from the walls of the city whilst attempting to flee, while the other was captured and beheaded. In August, Charles of Egmont finally received some physical support from France in the form of a guy called Robert de la Marck, the Lord of Sedan, with 500 lancers, 400 men-at-arms, and a few more knights, plus a few thousand men from Liège under the command of another guy called Peter the Bastard of Bourbon. The arrival of these French troops in Guelders sent shivers down the spine of Guillaume de Croix, the Lord of Chièvres, who saw the potential for these soldiers to go and wreak havoc outside of Guelders and to rampage through Brabant and Holland. It was at this time that Louis XII, the King of France, received news of Philip the Handsome's death at the beginning of October 1506. In a letter of condolence, Louis XII wrote, quote, I have loved the father, and I love his children no less, and knowing that they would now be served by no war, I have ordered the Duke of Guelders and the Lord of Sedan, Robert de la Marck, to refrain from hostilities." End quote. Philip the Handsome's death certainly had the potential to stir things up in the conflict over Guelders. It was around this time that the siege of Wageningen was broken up, and both sides left the field to settle in for the winter months. The Habsburg troops were then split in twain, so that half of them were in the Habsburg loyalist towns, and the other half were encamped along the Maas River, where they could remain on alert for any unexpected movements made by Charles of Egmont's forces. Then there were ongoing diplomatic attempts made between the various parties in Guelders to settle their differences, exchange some prisoners, pay ransoms, swap lands, and all the usual stuff. A truce was even offered in Mechelen on October 14th, 1506, to halt the hostilities until May 1507. But ultimately, Charles of Egmont was not inclined towards peace at this point, since any break in fighting now, when he had finally received reinforcements from France, would only benefit the other side. That would give them time to regroup and then once again go on the offensive. It was, don't forget, only a year earlier that the Habsburg armies had conquered half of his lands. Can you really blame him for not exactly being full of trust for the other side? So it was that Charles of Egmont continued to hustle throughout Guelders. And speaking of hustling, ding ding ding, that brings us to today's edition of Bet You Didn't Know That Was Dutch. The English word hustle actually comes from the Middle Dutch word husselen or hutselen, which means to shake, swing, or rock. So when you next listen to Biggie Smalls rapping about hustling in front of buildings while he's just trying to make money to feed his daughter, rest assured that he is in fact being Dutch. Hustle. Bet you didn't know that was Dutch. And if you don't know, now you know. Zeker. We'll be back after this short break. Welkom terug. Welcome back. The news of Philip's demise arrived in the Low Countries on October 3rd, 1506, a couple of weeks after the event. First, the Council of Holland was informed in a secret letter written by Maximilian, who historian Helmut Königsberger says was convinced that the French king had actually poisoned his son. The news was then distributed to the different courts around the Low Countries. One story relates that a ship captain in Zierikzee, Zeeland, who had just returned from Spain, incredulously reported that he had seen the king in fair health only just before departing. He was detained and interrogated by the magistrates of Zierikzee, and their report was then presented to Guillaume de Croix. The States General was summoned to assemble on the 15th of October, and foremost on their agenda was, quote, to aid and advise as may be necessary and without reference back on all matters needful for the good and welfare of our said lord and lands, end quote. Helmut Königsberger, in his book Monarchies, States Generals and Parliaments, points out that when the Chancellor of the Burgundian lands spoke to the States General, quote, he admitted immediately that he did not actually speak as Chancellor because his own and every other official's office had legally terminated with the Duke's death. By implication, the States General was therefore the only body which could function on their own authority. But no one actually spelt this out or discussed the constitutional implications of this position. Everyone, however, expected the States General to take the necessary decisions, end quote. And so they did. The States General said that the council and the courts would continue on in their offices as usual. Though this was not the first time such a thing had happened in the Low Countries. Wim Blockmans, for example, points to the 14th century precedents in Brabant during the minority of Jan III, which we covered way back in episode 14. It still seems significant that the government of the Low Countries writ large, again in the words of Königsberger, quote, therefore functioned by the grace and authority of the States General, end quote. With Philip's premature death in September 1506, the Low Countries were once more looking at a potential succession crisis, just as they had after the death of Mary of Burgundy in 1482 and Charles of the Bold in 1477. The said lord was, of course, Philip and Joanna's eldest son, Charles. Given his tender age of 6, however, the need to appoint a regent for him was paramount. Guess who would be the front runner for that job? I'm going to assume that you just shouted out, Maximilian! And so we'll give you 25 podcasting points for paying attention. The shrewd, egotistical old emperor, who had still not been crowned emperor, by the way, by the Pope, claimed the right to be guardian and regent for his grandson. In general, this was accepted by most of the estates, except for Flanders and Artois. Firstly, as we have well covered, Flanders and Maximilian did not have the best relational history with each other, especially when it came to him being regent, and besides, these two provinces were still fiefs of the French king, not the emperor. Legally, the French king actually had a 40-day period in which to claim the regency of those lands for himself, but he didn't, likely because he was immersed in the struggle over Milan, so he let the period pass and did not contend Maximilian's claim. There were some suggestions that perhaps Charles's mother Joanna could take up the position. However, she was in Spain, and as we covered in the previous episode, doubts had begun to manifest around her capabilities to rule, whether these were just doubts or not. So it was that after nearly a month of toing and froing, with no one else really viable for the role, the States General sent a delegation in November 1506 to Maximilian to offer him his second regency of the Low Countries. Funnily enough, Maximilian seemed to keep moving eastward away from the delegation, meaning it was not until January 1507 that he granted them an audience in Innsbruck. At the same time as taking the regency of the Low Countries, Maximilian also claimed the regency of Castile and began working on Ferdinand to accept their common grandson Charles as the heir to the Spanish kingdoms, which Ferdinand did. With the majority of his interests being taken up with the threat of the Turks and his designs in Italy and Spain, he also really wanted the Pope to finally crown him as emperor, and he would actually about 5 years after this event even suggest in a letter to his daughter that he should just become Pope himself. Anyway, he had a lot going on, old Max, and he pretty much instantly handballed the regency of the Netherlands over to the same most trusted kin and confidant of his, the inimitable Margaret of Austria. Margaret of Austria was by now 27 years old. Her life had been tumultuous to say the least. She had been engaged as a 3-year-old to the Dauphin of France, the future Charles VIII, carried away to the French court to be raised there and prepared for life as a queen, only to be unceremoniously cast aside by Charles when he decided to marry her father Maximilian's purported wife by proxy, Anne of Brittany. Margaret had then returned to the Low Countries, only to be married off once again by her father to Prince Juan in 1497. She almost died in a shipwreck on the voyage to Spain and wrote that famous poem that we talked about, lamenting the fact that she would die a virgin. But she got a second lease on life when she survived the storm and arrived in Spain to marry, and made sure that she definitely wouldn't die a virgin, but then perhaps too amorously enjoyed her husband's company beyond what his constitution and supply of turtles could handle. Her husband, Juan, died when she was 6 months pregnant, and their child was tragically stillborn. She had then sorrowfully returned to the Low Countries for a second time, only to be once again married off to Philibert, the Duke of Savoy, a relationship she actually seemed to cherish and flourish in. She used the experience she had garnered from her time in France and Spain to ensure that the reins of power in Savoy were held firmly in her grasp. But then Savoy Phil had also died tragically after too vigorously drinking water after a hunting trip. Margaret had then spent the time after Philibert's death meticulously planning and creating his tomb at the royal monastery of Brou. Tragedy and misfortune seemed to follow Margaret everywhere she went, but still, she threw herself headfirst into every task she faced. It was around this time that she created her personal motto, which would give insight into her character and eventually be carved in stone on her own tomb that would be next to Philibert's. This motto was Fortu, infortu, fortu. Fortune and infortune makes one strong. Margaret was going to need all of the strength she could muster, what with the mess she was walking into. On the international front, she was facing a cataclysm of massive egos clashing for ever bigger pieces of the pie. And on the domestic scene, there was uproar over the terrible trade arrangement with England and the increasing tensions of conflict with Guelders, which was soon to expand into Holland and Brabant. How that would all proceed, and what fortunes and infortunes awaited Margaret in her first attempt at governance of her homelands, are what await us in future episodes of History of the Netherlands. Thank you so much for listening to History of the Netherlands. We said at the start of the year we'd make an episode each month of 2026, and here we are in the month of May releasing this one. How good is productivity? It's almost as good as a revitalized Nam Demons football team in Melbourne, just exceeding everyone's expectations. Go the D's. From the outside, we probably look like calm ducks floating around on the surface of a beautiful Amsterdam canal, but below the surface, we are furiously paddling away with our little webbed feet, working hard to make sure we don't disappoint you, our loyal and beloved listeners. We want to quickly bring attention to the cover art that you may be noticing on each of our episodes. For this, we owe a massive thanks to the incredible Stephen Stratemans, our artist in residence, who does each piece lovingly. Steve, you do an incredible job, and we cannot thank you enough. This podcast would also not be possible without the help of the legendary people out there who have joined up our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/History of the Netherlands. There you can join up to the Treaty of Blois, a mutually beneficial trade agreement whereby you give us a small amount of money and we give you episodes of History of the Netherlands early and ad-free, plus the satisfaction of knowing that you're making it possible for your favorite Australian Dutch historians to dedicate as much time as they can to making this show. So we would love to extend a very heartfelt thanks to the following legendary people who have done just that. There is Oliver Raskin, Rascal as we call him. There is also Gillian, who I assume is Julian's female alter ego, but whom we call Beans, Jilly Beans. Julie Hadley, presumably related to the New Zealand cricketing great Richard Hadley. No? Well, now, in our hearts and minds, Julie, you are. Thanks, Kin of Paddles. And then there's also Tiff, Lovers as we call her. We cannot thank you enough. Follow us on Blue Sky at historyofnl.bsky.social if you want to get in touch. You can also follow us on Instagram at History of the Netherlands. If you want transcripts of each episode, or if you want to see the amazing episode artwork made for our shows by Stephen Stratemans, check out the show notes on our website, historyofthenetherlands.com. Until next time, tot de volgende keer. Doei! Thanks for listening to History of the Netherlands. You can get detailed show notes at our website, historyofthenetherlands.com. From there, you'll be able to find other podcasts and projects that we've created. This is a production of Republic of Amsterdam Radio.